One.
Hi, this is the gardening guys, Owen and Conway. Hi, my name is Conway. Today's topic is talking about how to correct some of the scenarios you have when you have your soil tested. On a previous segment, we explained about testing your soil using the soil test kit, and when we have the results, how do we go about correcting it? So one of the ones that we will encounter is you have your three different numbers, which is your nitrogen. Your middle number is your phosphorus, and your last number is your potash. So in this particular case right now, if your nitrogen is really low, which is not unusual here on the west coast and the lower mainland, we need to have something in there right now that will basically boost up your nitrogen. In this particular example right now, we're using an example using ammonium sulfate. This is a chemical fertilizer which basically can be applied onto your, let's say your vegetables is a good example right now, especially if you're trying to grow a lot of your leafy vegetables like your bok choy, your spinach, your lettuce, and it's only applied as a very small, what we call side dressing on the side of the plant. Again, always read the directions carefully on the package before using it, and make sure that the soil is moist before applying it, and make sure it gets good watering after, because this particular product potentially can burn if you overuse it. The other one we talked about is our phosphorus, which can be deficient, but usually tends to sort of accumulate over time. In this example right now, we're using one with a high middle number. This is using triple superphosphate, which is basically a mineral which is actually mined out of the ground. Again, when it's applied into the soil, it will basically stay there for a long period of time. So basically, as a rule of thumb, it's usually not that deficient too much here in the lower mainland where we are right now. So that's your phosphorus. On this side here right now is another mineral which is mined out of the ground, which is potash. And this particular one right now can be deficient, but once you put in the soil, it will stay there. And this particular one is basically used, let's say, to try to mature your plants, try to give them a little more disease tolerance, and also get your plants ready for the winter time. So it's one of those mystery plants that's more of a good for the well-being of the plant itself. Anytime, whenever you're using fertilizer, like I say right now, always use the recommended amount that's on the package or whatever on your instructions on your soil test kit. And you can always apply more later on rather than over apply, because once you over apply it, you can't really take it out. You can use an example, because these are using minerals and using a chemical fertilizer. You can get other derivatives, like in this case right now we have fish fertilizer, which is basically using fish, which will also give you a higher nitrogen content. Okay, so that's basically using fish. On the other hand, for your phosphate, most people are probably familiar with using bone meal as an example, and that can also be used to give you some sort of phosphorus. In this particular case, or another organic one, we're using seaweed or kelp, and this can also be used as a derivative to sort of enhance your potash. Generally speaking, for your organic fertilizers, the numbers always tend to be more smaller in analysis. So in terms of percentage of food by nature, it's smaller compared to what you would normally have for your potash. In this particular case, this is 50% by volume is potash. In this case, in here right now, this is only less than 0.5%. In here right now, for your nitrogen is 21% by volume. In this case, it's only 5%. The other numbers are missing, so in this particular case, this is considered an incomplete fertilizer. This is considered a complete fertilizer. The other thing that we're looking at right now is testing the soil pH. So as I sort of mentioned on the onset, when we have soil testing, that our soils around here traditionally tends to be very acidic because we get a lot of rain. So therefore, we have to sort of increase our soil pH. So our pH is usually running from a figure from 1 to 14. 7 is considered neutral. So anything less than 7, let's say 6 to 6.5, is ideal for your plants to absorb nutrients at a more broader range. So in this case right now, we tend to sort of use lime as an example to sort of help increase your soil pH. In this case, it does have a little bit of other component. In this case, it has a little bit of magnesium, which is also important, but in very small amounts. But in this case right now, that's where word dolo means. It has some magnesium in it. But it's dolomite lime, and that's a lime that's basically a calcium that's used to sort of make your soil a little bit more alkaline. Now, on the other hand, if you're trying to grow plants that don't want to be as alkaline, and of course, I should mention alkalinity is important for some plants that can tolerate, let's say if you're growing a lot of your cabbages, or if you're growing a lot of your herbs, they can tolerate a lot of lime because they come from parts of the world where it tends to be more alkaline. But if you're trying to grow other plants which are more acid loving, let's say as an example, your hydrangeas, your potatoes, your blueberries, then we also have to sort of try to what we call acidify your soil. So in this particular case right now, we're using sulfur. Any particular fertilizer, as I mentioned earlier on, even like ammonium sulfate, even though it does have your nitrogen, anything that has a little bit of sulfur, generally speaking, will tend to acidify your soil. So sulfur being one element, you can also use that by using things like peat moss if it's mixed in the soil with other things, so it doesn't create a caking. Or you can also use any sort of other compost, but generally as a rule of thumb, you try to avoid things like mushroom manure, because mushroom manure always tend to have a little bit more lime to it. Another thing, that most commonly thing that most people usually ask for, is how to sort of blue up your hydrangea. And if you want to get a really good blue cover, not all hydrangeas will blue up that well, is basically using aluminum sulfate. And this is one that's also the sulfate that makes it more into that shade of blue, but there's also to some degree very small amounts of aluminum that are used in the soil that will enhance that color of the blue. It doesn't work for all hydrangeas. Some hydrangeas do better, especially if they're more established. Some particular plants, like for instance Nico Blue, is a selection of a very old hydrangea. That one tends to sort of blue by itself very easily for us here on the west coast. But aluminum sulfate can be used, but you have to be very, very cautious when using it, because if you apply too much of it, this stuff can be toxic to plants. But it usually should be, if you're trying to sort of make your hydrangeas more blue, it should be done at least a year before the actual flowering time. So it should be done at least, let's say, 2 applications prior to the beginning of the following year.
Is that because it's a slow release?
It's not slow release as per se. It's just something that you want to sort of do gradually, because it's sort of, you're altering the pH very drastically, and there's concern that it might end up damaging your plant.
So what if the customer comes in buy hydrangea and now they're gonna plant it and now they think that they have to force the color into more blue or more red? Will that work when they apply it as soon as possible as they planted it?
For a plant that's already being planted in the ground, it doesn't work as well. It works better when the plants are more established in the garden, as a general rule of thumb. But not all hydrangeas will actually give you that coloration. Some will do it quite easily. Like I say, Nico Blue is one that will change, that will normally just go blue by itself without you adding anything around here. Others will change a lot more easier. But in most cases, I think most people may sort of like it, just let Mother Nature do its thing.
So, what advice do you give for someone who wants to change a little bit of the tint of red hydrangea into more deeper red?
That would be, in terms of anything in the pinker shades right now, it's mostly using some sort of lime.
Lime. So we have the sulfur on one side,
And
sulfate,
then,
aluminum sulfate for the
yeah, and
bluish
then the
side,
lime would be
and the
these.
lime will be on the reddish side.
But it
Okay.
doesn't work for all plants. I mean, all hydrangeas, pardon me.
And of course, that's because the gene, if the gene is white, it cannot change to
Yeah.
anything else. It
So
depends on the gene.
yeah, so some, because of hydrangeas have basically been programmed for specific colors. Some of them, like I say, will change probably a lot more easier than others, and some of them, of course, usually around here right now that we're very fortunate that our soils are very acidic. But as they say, in places like in England, where some of the soils tend to be very alkaline, you have to keep doing it all the time in order to maintain that blue coloration.
You can take it.
So, if there isn't, until we
Nope.
see you next time, go green.